You know, after more than 40 years sitting on this bench, I've learned something important. Life doesn't always give people a fair schedule. The law runs on calendars, dates, and deadlines, but human beings run on love, responsibility, and sacrifice. And sometimes those two worlds collide in my courtroom in a way that stops me cold. One particular morning reminded me why I never rush to judgment and why listening is the most powerful tool a judge can have. Before I tell you about that day, let me ask you something. Have you ever been pulled in two directions at once, knowing that no matter what you chose, something important would suffer? That's exactly the kind of situation that walked into my courtroom that morning. And trust me, what I learned changed the way I looked at a simple missed court date forever. I've been a judge in Providence for over 40 years. Every weekday morning, my routine is almost exactly the same. I wake up early, usually before the sun. I sit at my kitchen table with a cup of strong black coffee, the same way I've had it for decades. My wife always tells me I should slow down, but habits stick with you after a lifetime. By 8:15, I'm walking into the courthouse, nodding to the same security officers I've known for years. When I step into my chambers, Christina, my clerk, is already there. She knows how I like things done. Files neatly stacked, calendar reviewed, coffee ready. I've always believed that preparation is a form of respect. Respect for the court, and respect for the people who are about to stand in front of me. My father taught me that. He came to this country with nothing but a work ethic and a belief that fairness matters. That particular morning felt ordinary at first. I remember flipping through the case files, scanning names, charges, notes, parking violations, missed appearances, minor offenses, the kind of cases people often think don't matter. But I've learned that for the person standing in front of me, that case might be the biggest thing in their life at that moment. I never forget that. As I took my seat on the bench, I looked out at my courtroom. I saw the wooden benches, the quiet tension, the nervous faces. I've seen fear, arrogance, relief, and gratitude all pass through that room. I've learned to read people not just by what they say, but how they stand, how they breathe, how they avoid eye contact. That skill comes with time and with paying attention. The morning docket started like any other, one case after another. Some people were defensive, some were apologetic, some tried to explain their way out of trouble. I listened, I asked questions, I ruled. Then Christina called a name that caught my attention because of a simple note written in the file. Failure to appear. I've seen thousands of those. When someone misses a court date, the system doesn't usually care why. A missed date is a missed date. Bench warrants get issued. Fines increase. Problems multiply. But I've always believed that the word why matters. So when I looked up and saw a man walking slowly toward the podium, I paid close attention. I watched him as he stood there. He wasn't dressed poorly, but he wasn't polished either. His shoulders were slightly hunched, like he was carrying more weight than just his own body. I could see exhaustion in his face. Not the kind you get from a late night, but the deep kind that comes from long-term responsibility. I've seen that look before. I asked him to state his name, and I heard his voice shake just a little. Not from fear of me, but from nerves. I told him calmly why he was there. I said he had missed his court date, and that a warrant had been issued as a result. I watched his eyes widen. He nodded slowly, like he already knew he was in trouble. I asked him a simple question. I said, "Why didn't you come to court?" I've learned to ask that question without accusation. I don't raise my voice. I don't assume the worst. I just listen. When I asked him that, he took a deep breath. I could see him gathering himself like this wasn't easy to talk about. He looked at me and said, very quietly, that he was taking care of his mother. When he said that, I leaned forward slightly. I've heard that answer before, but something about his tone told me there was more. I asked him to explain. I told him to take his time. My courtroom doesn't run on shame. It runs on truth. He told me his mother was disabled. He said she couldn't walk on her own. He said she needed help with almost everything: bathing, eating, getting out of bed. He said that on the day of his court date, she had a medical emergency. He couldn't leave her alone. There was no one else, no siblings nearby, no home nurse available that day. As he spoke, I watched his hands. They were rough, working hands, hands that had lifted more than paperwork in their life. I watched his eyes fill with emotion, and I knew he wasn't making excuses. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was explaining a reality, and I felt something shift in my chest. I've presided over cases involving millionaires and people with nothing. I've learned that responsibility doesn't come with a paycheck, it comes with character. And this man was carrying a responsibility that no court summons could outweigh. I thought about my own parents. I thought about how my father worked until his body wouldn't let him anymore. I thought about how family steps up when the world doesn't. I asked him if he had tried to contact the court that day. He nodded and said he had called, but he didn't know who to speak to. He said everything happened so fast. I could hear the frustration in his voice, the kind that comes from trying to do the right thing and still ending up in trouble. At that moment, my courtroom was silent. Everyone was listening. I could feel the weight of the decision in front of me. The law would allow me to impose penalties. It would allow me to say rules are rules. But I've learned that justice isn't about automatic responses. It's about understanding context. I took a moment. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes. I do that when I need to slow myself down. I looked back at him and asked one more question. I asked him how long he had been caring for his mother. He said several years. No complaint, no self-praise, just a fact. I remember thinking to myself that this man wasn't asking the court to bend for convenience. Life had bent him already, and he was still standing. I looked at the file again. A missed date, that was it. No reckless behavior, no harm to others. Just a system that didn't see the whole picture until now. I knew what I had to do, but I wanted him to hear it clearly. I told him that taking care of a disabled parent is not a small thing. I told him that responsibility like that matters. I said that while the court expects people to appear, the court also has an obligation to be humane. I could see his eyes searching my face, like he wasn't sure where this was going. I said something my father used to tell me. I said that character is revealed when no one is watching, and I told him that what he did that day showed character, not disrespect. I felt the room breathe again. I could hear someone in the back sniffle. These are the moments people don't see on television. I told him I was going to clear the case. I said the missed court date would not follow him. I said there would be no fine, no warrant, no penalty. I watched his face change. I watched disbelief turn into relief. His shoulders dropped for the first time since he walked in. He thanked me, but I could tell words weren't enough. His eyes said everything. I nodded and told him to take care of his mother. I told him that's where he was needed most. As he walked away from the podium, I felt a quiet certainty. This was why I still wore the robe after all these years. And that was just the beginning of that day. As that man walked out of my courtroom, I sat back in my chair for a moment longer than usual. I don't always do that, but sometimes a case stays with me. I watched the door close behind him, and I thought about how close he came to being punished for doing the right thing. That's a thought that never sits easy with me. Christina called the next case, and the docket kept moving, but my mind went back to that man and his mother. I've seen people come into my courtroom angry about parking tickets, fines, or paperwork. But caring for another human being, especially a parent, that's a different kind of burden. That's not something you choose lightly. That's something life puts on your shoulders. I remember my own mother as she got older. I remember how proud she was, how she hated asking for help even when she needed it. I also remember how my father never complained. He just did what needed to be done. Watching that growing up shaped the way I see responsibility. It's not loud. It doesn't ask for applause. It just shows up every day. The courtroom stayed busy that morning. People came and went. Some were relieved, some were disappointed, some learned lessons the hard way. But every so often I caught myself thinking about that missed court date and how easily the system could have failed him. The law is powerful, but it's blind without context. That's something I remind myself of constantly. At one point during a short break, Christina leaned over and quietly said, "That was the right call." She doesn't say that often. She's seen as many cases as I have. When she said it, I just nodded. I didn't need validation, but it was good to know we were on the same page. Justice works best when everyone involved remembers why they're there. When court resumed, I noticed something else. The gallery felt different. People were listening more closely. I could feel it. Sometimes one moment of compassion resets the tone of an entire room. It reminds everyone that this isn't just about rules, it's about people. Later that morning, another case came up that echoed the same theme in a different way. A younger man stood before me, clearly nervous. I asked him what brought him in, and he started talking too fast, tripping over his words. I slowed him down. I told him to breathe. I've learned that fear makes people forget how to speak. As he explained his situation, I realized how many people are one emergency away from trouble. One sick parent, one broken car, one missed phone call. Suddenly, they're standing in front of a judge, trying to explain their life in 2 minutes. That's not easy, and it's not always fair. I looked out over my courtroom again. I saw faces from all walks of life, different ages, different backgrounds, but the same anxiety, the same hope that someone would listen. I've never believed that justice should feel like a machine. Machines don't care. People do. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to say something, not just to the people in front of me, but to myself. I reminded myself why I took this job in the first place. I didn't become a judge to feel powerful. I became a judge to balance the law with humanity. During lunch, I sat alone in my chambers eating a simple sandwich. I don't go out much during the day. I like the quiet. I replayed the morning in my head. That man's voice, his honesty, the relief on his face. Those moments don't make headlines, but they matter more than most people realize. I thought about how easily someone could look at a missed court date and see disrespect. But disrespect wasn't what I saw. I saw devotion. I saw sacrifice. I saw someone choosing a helpless person over a piece of paper. And I knew that if the law couldn't recognize that, then the law needed a human voice. When court resumed in the afternoon, the pace picked up again, but my patience stayed steady. I've learned that impatience clouds judgment. Every person who stands before me deserves my full attention, even if their case seems small, especially then. Near the end of the session, something unexpected happened. Christina called another name, and as the person approached, I recognized him. It was the same man from earlier. He stood there awkwardly, almost apologetically, like he wasn't sure he should be there again. I looked at him and asked what he needed. He told me he just wanted to say thank you properly. He said he hadn't slept well for weeks, worrying about the warrant. He said he could finally breathe again. As he spoke, his voice cracked. He stopped himself and apologized for getting emotional. I told him not to apologize. There's no rule against caring. He told me his mother was stable now. He said she had asked him where he had gone that morning. He told her he had gone to court and that the judge had understood. When he said that, I felt something tighten in my chest. Being understood is rare. Being heard is even rarer. I told him to give his mother my best. I told him to keep doing what he was doing. I told him that the world needs more people like him, even if it doesn't always make it easy. He nodded, thanked me again, and left. This time he walked a little straighter. After court adjourned, I stayed behind for a while. I always do. I like to reflect at the end of the day. I removed my robe and hung it carefully. That robe carries a lot of weight, not just authority, but responsibility. Every decision leaves a mark, whether you see it or not. As I gathered my things, I thought about how many stories pass through that room every week. Most of them will never be told, but they shape lives in quiet ways. That man caring for his disabled mother may never think of himself as remarkable, but from where I sit, he represents the best of us. On my drive home, the sun was low in the sky. I turned off the radio and drove in silence. I do that when I need to process. I thought about my own family waiting for me at home. I thought about how lucky I was to be able to help, even in small ways. That night, over dinner, my wife asked me how my day was. I told her about the man and his mother. She listened the way she always does, without interrupting. When I finished, she smiled and said, "That's why you still care." She was right. Caring is the only way this job works. I went to bed that night thinking about how justice doesn't always come from punishment. Sometimes it comes from understanding. Sometimes it comes from knowing when not to add more weight to someone who's already caring enough. And as I drifted off to sleep, I had a feeling that this story wasn't over yet. Not for him, not for me, and not for the lessons that day still had to teach. The next morning I woke up thinking about responsibility again. It's funny how one case can follow you home, settle into your thoughts, and refuse to leave. As I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, I stared out the window longer than usual. I was thinking about how many people quietly carry burdens the rest of the world never sees. I got to the courthouse at my usual time, same walk, same greeting from security, same familiar sounds echoing through the halls. But inside I felt more reflective than normal. I took my time reviewing the day's docket, names, dates, charges. Each one represented a person with a story, whether they knew how to tell it or not. Christina noticed it too. She asked me if I was all right. I smiled and told her I was fine. Judges aren't supposed to be emotional, but we're still human. We just learn how to carry it quietly. I told her I was just thinking about how close some people are to falling through the cracks. Court began, and the morning moved along steadily. I listened. I asked questions. I ruled. But every time someone mentioned a missed date or a failure to appear, my mind went back to that man and his mother. It made me listen harder. It made me ask better questions. Midway through the morning, something unexpected happened. Christina leaned over and handed me a note. It said that the man from the previous day had called the clerk's office. My first thought was concern. I wondered if something had gone wrong. I asked Christina to check what it was about. A few minutes later, she came back and told me he wasn't calling about himself. He was calling to ask how to properly notify the court if his mother had another emergency in the future. He didn't want to make the same mistake again. When I heard that, I felt a deep sense of respect. You see, that told me everything I needed to know about his character. He wasn't looking for special treatment. He wasn't trying to avoid responsibility. He was trying to do things the right way, even while caring for someone who depended on him completely. I asked Christina to explain the process to him carefully. I wanted him to know that the court wasn't his enemy. The system can be confusing, especially when you're overwhelmed. Part of justice is helping people navigate it, not just punishing them when they stumble. As the day went on, I found myself thinking about how often people assume the worst. A missed court date gets labeled as disrespect. Silence gets labeled as avoidance. But sometimes silence is exhaustion. Sometimes absence is sacrifice. That's why I never rush. I remembered a case from early in my career. A young woman had missed court because she was in the hospital with her child. Back then, I didn't ask enough questions. I followed procedure too closely. I still remember the look on her face. That memory has stayed with me for decades. It taught me that justice without listening is incomplete. Late in the afternoon, court slowed down. The room felt quieter. That's when I saw a familiar figure standing near the doorway. It was the same man again. This time he wasn't approaching the podium. He was just standing there, hesitant. I caught his eye and nodded for him to come forward. He apologized for bothering the court again. I told him he wasn't bothering anyone. I asked what was on his mind. He told me he had been thinking all night about what had happened. He said no one in authority had ever taken the time to listen to him before. That stayed with me. He said caring for his mother had been isolating. Friends drifted away. Jobs became harder to keep. Life narrowed down to hospital visits and long nights. He said sometimes it felt like the world didn't see him at all. As he spoke, I felt the room grow still again. I told him something I believed deeply. I told him that society runs because of people like him. People who step up when it's hard. People who do the unseen work. I said that courts exist to serve justice, not to crush people under it. I watched his eyes fill with tears. He told me his mother used to worry that she was a burden. He told her that she wasn't. He said that when he told her what happened in court, she cried too. She told him that maybe the world still had some kindness left in it. Hearing that humbled me. I told him that kindness and justice aren't opposites, they're partners. When used together, they do the most good. I reminded him to take care of himself too. Caregivers forget that sometimes. He nodded like he hadn't heard that advice in a long time. When he left the courtroom again, I felt a sense of closure, but I also felt a responsibility. Stories like his don't always get told. People see court as cold and unforgiving. They don't see the moments where understanding changes everything. That evening, I stayed late again. I reviewed files, but my thoughts kept drifting. I thought about how many caregivers never get a break. How many people are punished not for wrongdoing, but for being overwhelmed. I wondered how many chances the system misses to show humanity. On my way home, I stopped by a small grocery store. I saw a man helping an elderly woman load bags into a car. He moved patiently, carefully. No one was watching, no one was applauding. But I noticed. And it reminded me that quiet decency is everywhere if you pay attention. At home, my grandson called me. He wanted help with homework. As I talked him through a math problem, I thought about the future. I thought about the kind of world we're building for him. A world where rules matter, but compassion matters just as much. Before going to bed, I wrote a note to myself. I do that sometimes. I wrote that listening is not weakness. I wrote that understanding is not softness. I wrote that justice should always leave room for humanity. That note stayed on my desk for a long time. The next day would bring new cases, new faces, new decisions. But that man and his disabled mother had already left a mark on me. They reminded me that behind every file is a life, and behind every missed date there might be a story worth hearing. And I knew deep down that this lesson would stay with me for the rest of my time on the bench. By the end of that week, the courthouse felt heavier to me than usual. Not in a bad way, but in a reflective way. I found myself paying closer attention to the small details. The way people entered the room, the way they avoided eye contact, the way relief showed on their faces when they felt heard. That man caring for his mother had quietly reset something inside me. One morning, as I reviewed the docket, I noticed how many cases were tied to missed obligations, missed dates, missed payments, missed paperwork. On paper, it all looked the same, but I knew better. Life doesn't hand out equal starting points. Some people run uphill every single day. Christina brought me my coffee and asked if I wanted to move one case to the afternoon. She could tell I was deep in thought. I thanked her and smiled. After 4 decades, she can read me better than most people. I told her I was just reminding myself not to rush. She nodded. She understands that too. That morning, several caregivers stood before me. One was caring for a sick spouse, another for a child with special needs. I didn't plan it that way, but sometimes life aligns cases like that. Each story was different, but the theme was the same: responsibility, sacrifice, fatigue. I listened carefully to each one. As the day went on, I kept thinking about how the law often measures compliance, not commitment. It measures whether you showed up, not why you couldn't. That's a dangerous gap if you don't fill it with understanding. A court without empathy becomes a factory for resentment. Late that afternoon, I received a call in my chambers. It was from a social worker connected to the man's mother. She wanted to clarify some paperwork related to medical assistance. She mentioned his name, and I recognized it immediately. She didn't know who I was. She just spoke openly. She told me how dedicated he was. She said he never missed appointments. She said he advocated fiercely for his mother. She said caregivers like him burn out quietly because they don't complain. When I hung up the phone, I sat there for a long moment. I thought about how close he came to being labeled irresponsible by the system. One missed date, one piece of paper. That's all it takes sometimes. I felt grateful that he had come before me instead of someone who might not have listened. That evening I drove home slowly. I didn't turn on the radio. I let the quiet settle. I thought about how many people carry invisible jobs. Jobs without pay, without recognition, without days off. Caring for another human being is the hardest job there is. At home, my wife noticed I was quieter than usual. She asked what was on my mind. I told her about the call from the social worker. I told her how easily things could have gone wrong. She shook her head and said the world moves too fast for people like that. She was right. The next week, court resumed as usual, but I noticed something else. Word travels fast. People talk in waiting rooms. They share stories. I could sense that people were less defensive when they stood before me. They spoke more openly. They trusted that I would listen. One morning, a woman approached the podium and said she had heard about a man who missed court because he was caring for his mother. She said it gave her hope. She was caring for her father, and she had been terrified to explain her situation. I told her to take a breath and tell her story. That's when it hit me. Compassion multiplies. One act of understanding doesn't just help one person. It creates space for others to speak up. It reminds people they're not alone. That's how justice builds trust. I remembered something my father used to say. He said, "Power means nothing if it doesn't help the powerless." Sitting on this bench gives me authority, but authority without wisdom is dangerous. Wisdom comes from listening, especially when it's inconvenient. Midweek, I saw the man again. This time, he wasn't involved in any case. He was sitting quietly in the gallery. I noticed him right away. When there was a pause, I asked him why he was there. He looked surprised that I recognized him. He said he had a few hours of respite care that day. Someone was with his mother and he wanted to observe court. He said he wanted to understand the system better. That told me a lot. He wasn't bitter, he was curious. He wanted to learn. I told him he was welcome any time. I watched him sit attentively, listening to other cases. He nodded occasionally. Sometimes he smiled when someone received compassion. Sometimes he looked down when someone was struggling. He was absorbing it all. After court, he approached me again. He told me that watching from the gallery helped him understand how overwhelmed everyone else was too. He said it made him feel less alone. I told him that perspective is powerful. It changes how you carry your own load. He also told me something else. He said caring for his mother had taught him patience. He said he didn't realize how much that mattered until he stood in my courtroom. He said seeing patients from the bench helped him reflect on his own life. I thanked him for saying that. Judges don't always hear feedback like that. It meant more than he probably realized. When he left, I felt grounded. These are the moments that keep you steady in a job that can harden people if they let it. That night I sat at my desk at home and wrote again. I wrote that justice should never feel like a door slamming shut. It should feel like a door opening to understanding. I wrote that rules exist to guide behavior, not to erase humanity. As the weeks passed, the memory of that missed court date didn't fade. It became a reference point. When I felt myself getting impatient, I thought of him lifting his mother from bed. When someone struggled to explain themselves, I remembered his quiet honesty. I realized something important. That case wasn't about clearing a file. It was about recognizing dignity. Dignity doesn't disappear when life gets hard. Sometimes it shines brightest then. And as I continued my work on the bench, I knew that this story, simple as it seemed, would stay with me. Not because it was dramatic, not because it made headlines, but because it reminded me of why understanding is the heart of justice. By the time a month had passed, that case had become something more than a memory. It had become a lens through which I saw other people. I noticed how often caregivers walked into my courtroom already defeated, not by the law, but by exhaustion. They didn't come in angry, they came in tired. There's a difference, and it matters. One morning, as I reviewed the docket, I paused on a familiar last name. It was his. My first reaction was concern. I wondered if something had gone wrong again. I checked the notes carefully. It wasn't a violation. It was a request for information. That alone told me he was trying to stay ahead of things, not run from them. Later that day, he stood before me again, this time more composed. I could see the fatigue was still there, but there was something else now too. Confidence, not arrogance, just steadiness. He had learned how to navigate the system a little better. That's not something you can teach in a pamphlet. It comes from feeling respected. He told me his mother's condition had stabilized, but caring for her was still a full-time responsibility. He said he had adjusted his work hours. He said money was tight but manageable. He wasn't asking for anything. He was updating the court because he didn't want any misunderstandings in the future. I thanked him for that. I told him that communication matters. I also told him something else. I said the court exists to serve people, not intimidate them. When I said that, he nodded slowly, like it confirmed something he had been hoping was true. As he stepped away, I felt a quiet pride, not in myself, but in the process working the way it should. Justice doesn't always mean imposing something. Sometimes it means removing an unnecessary burden. That afternoon, I had a conversation with a younger attorney who was observing court. He asked me why I took so much time listening to explanations. He said some judges would have issued a fine without discussion. I told him something I learned the hard way. I told him that efficiency without empathy leads to injustice. I told him that a courtroom is not an assembly line. Every person brings a lifetime of context with them. Ignoring that context doesn't make the system stronger, it makes it brittle. He listened carefully. I could tell he was thinking about it. I told him that one day he might be standing where I am, and when that day comes, he'll have to decide what kind of authority he wants to be known for. Authority that listens lasts longer. As weeks turned into months, I occasionally heard updates about the man and his mother through court staff and community connections. Nothing dramatic, just small victories, a successful therapy session, a new home aide, a little more stability. Those small things matter more than most people realize. One afternoon, Christina came into my chambers with a letter. She told me it had been addressed to the court, but specifically mentioned me. I opened it carefully. It was from him. He thanked me again, but that wasn't what stood out. He wrote about how the experience changed the way he viewed institutions. He said he had always assumed systems didn't care about people like him. He said he had learned that sometimes it depends on who is willing to listen. That letter stayed with me. I placed it in a drawer where I keep reminders, not reminders of success, but reminders of responsibility. Those are more important. They keep you grounded when the job gets heavy. Around that same time, another caregiver stood before me with a similar issue, a missed appointment, a missed deadline. As she spoke, she referenced hearing about a case where a judge had listened. I realized then how stories travel, even when they're quiet. I asked her the same questions. I listened the same way, and once again, understanding made the difference. Compassion doesn't weaken the law. It strengthens trust in it. Trust is what keeps people coming back willingly instead of fearfully. At home one night, my wife and I talked about caregiving. She reminded me of times we had helped family members without thinking twice. She said people don't always see that as extraordinary. They see it as duty. But duty carried with love is something special. I thought about how many caregivers don't identify themselves as such. They just say, "It's my mother," or "It's my father," as if that explains everything, and in a way it does. Love doesn't need a title. One evening, I received a call from a community group that supports caregivers. They asked if I would be willing to speak at an event about navigating legal responsibilities while caregiving. I agreed, not because I liked speaking, but because the message mattered. At that event, I shared a version of this story. I didn't use names. I didn't share details. But I spoke about listening. I spoke about context. I spoke about how the law should recognize sacrifice, not punish it blindly. I watched heads nod. I watched eyes fill. Afterward, a woman approached me. She said she had missed court once because her husband had dementia. She said she never explained herself because she assumed no one would care. Hearing that broke my heart a little. It also reinforced why this work matters. Back on the bench, I carried those conversations with me. Every caregiver who stood before me after that day got my full attention. Not special treatment, just full attention. That's the least justice can offer. I realized something else too. Understanding doesn't mean lowering standards. It means applying them wisely. The goal of the law is not to trap people. It's to guide behavior and protect dignity. One afternoon, as I ended court, I looked out at the empty room. I thought about how many untold stories had passed through there, how many moments of quiet humanity had shaped outcomes without anyone ever knowing. That's the real work. And I knew this story still had one more chapter left, because when people are treated with understanding, they often pay it forward. And I had a feeling I was about to see that happen. One morning, several months later, something happened that reminded me how far the ripple of one decision can travel. I was reviewing files in my chambers when Christina mentioned a familiar name again. This time, it wasn't connected to a problem. It was connected to a thank you. She told me the man had dropped off a small envelope at the clerk's window. No request, no issue, just something he wanted the court to have. I opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note and a photograph. The photograph showed his mother sitting in a wheelchair, smiling. He was standing behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. The smile on his face wasn't big, but it was peaceful. That kind of peace doesn't come easily. It comes from endurance. In the note, he wrote that his mother had wanted me to see the picture. She had asked him to tell the judge who listened that she was grateful. He wrote that she didn't understand much about the legal system, but she understood kindness. That line stayed with me. I sat there holding that note for a long time. In 40 years on the bench, I've received letters from attorneys, officials, even politicians. But notes like that are different. They don't flatter. They remind you what matters. That same day, I saw him again in the hallway. This time, he looked different, not rested. Caregivers rarely are, but steadier. He told me his mother was having a good week. Those are precious when they come. I congratulated him. He told me something else that surprised me. He said he had started helping another caregiver in his neighborhood, a woman caring for her disabled brother. He helped her understand paperwork, appointments, and court notices. He said he didn't want her to feel as lost as he once did. When he said that, I felt a quiet sense of awe. That's how change really happens. Not through speeches, not through policies alone, through people helping people because they remember what it felt like to struggle. I thanked him for that. I told him that helping one person carry a burden lightens the whole community. He smiled and said he had learned that in my courtroom. I corrected him. I told him he had learned it in his own life. I had just listened. That afternoon, as court went on, I found myself thinking about legacy, not the kind that comes with plaques or titles, the kind that shows up in how people treat each other. Judges don't often get to see the long-term effects of their decisions. That day, I did. Later in the week, I attended a small community meeting related to caregiving resources. I sat quietly in the back. I don't announce myself in those settings. I just listen. And there he was again, sitting beside his mother, advocating calmly, clearly. I watched him explain her needs. I watched him ask questions. I watched him thank people for their time. He wasn't demanding. He was respectful. He had learned how to navigate systems without losing his humanity. That's not easy. As I watched, I thought about how easily this story could have gone another way. A fine, a warrant, more stress, more fear. A man pushed closer to the edge. Instead, understanding had created confidence. Confidence had created growth. That night I wrote in my notebook again. I wrote that justice should never create hopelessness where responsibility already exists. I wrote that courts should be a place where people feel seen, not erased. Weeks later, something else happened that brought everything full circle. A new case came before me, a missed appearance. The person standing at the podium looked terrified. I asked why they missed court. They hesitated, then mentioned caregiving. Before I could ask more, they said, almost apologetically, that someone had told them it was okay to explain. They said someone had told them the judge would listen. I felt the weight of that trust immediately. I listened. I asked questions. I understood. And once again, justice found its balance. After court, I sat back and thought about how trust, once earned, becomes a responsibility you can't take lightly. That evening, I received a message from the Caregiver support group. They told me the man had become a volunteer coordinator. They said he was patient, organized, and reliable. I wasn't surprised. Responsibility had always been his strength. I thought about how caregiving often goes unnoticed because it happens behind closed doors. But when someone finally sees it, really sees it, it can change the trajectory of a life. That's not something I take credit for. It's something I respect. At home, my wife and I talked about aging, about how everyone eventually needs help, about how the measure of a society is how it treats those who can't give anything back. She said she hoped there would always be people like him around. I agreed. As time passed, I saw him less often. That's usually a good sign. It means stability. It means fewer emergencies. It means life finding a rhythm again. But I never forgot him. Some cases stay with you forever. One afternoon, as I ended court, I stood alone in the empty courtroom. I looked at the bench, the podium, the seats. I thought about how many lives intersect there briefly, how many decisions echo long after the room empties. I realized something important. The law didn't clear his case. Listening did. Understanding did. Humanity did. The law simply allowed room for it. And as I turned off the lights and walked out, I felt grateful. Grateful that after all these years, I could still be reminded of why this work matters. Grateful that justice, when guided by compassion, can actually make lives better. I knew there was one final piece to this story, one last moment that would tie it all together. And when it came, it reminded me once again that doing the right thing quietly is often the most powerful thing of all. The final chapter of this story came to me quietly, the way most meaningful things do. It didn't arrive with an announcement or a courtroom moment. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon, long after the case itself had faded from the docket. I was in my chambers finishing paperwork when Christina knocked softly and stepped inside. She told me there was someone asking to see me briefly. She said they weren't part of any case. She said they just wanted a moment. When she said the name, I already knew who it was. He walked in slowly, respectfully, just as he always did. He looked older than the first day I saw him, but there was peace in his face. Not relief, peace, the kind that comes when life is still hard but manageable. I asked him how his mother was doing. He took a breath before answering. He told me his mother had passed away the week before. He didn't say it dramatically. He said it the way caregivers do when they've already done their grieving quietly over many nights. I stood up from my chair. I don't always do that, but it felt right. I told him I was sorry for his loss. I meant it deeply. Caring for someone like that changes you forever. When they're gone, the silence can feel overwhelming. He nodded. He said it had been difficult, but he was grateful he had been there for her until the end. He told me she had asked about me near the end. She didn't remember many details, but she remembered that someone in authority had treated her son with dignity. When he said that, I had to look down for a moment. There are things you hear in this job that stay with you forever. That was one of them. He said he didn't come to ask for anything. He just wanted me to know that my decision that day had mattered more than I could imagine. He said it had eased her worries. It had reassured her that her son wouldn't be punished for loving her. I told him something I believed deeply. I told him that caring for her was one of the most honorable things a person can do. I told him that the law exists to protect people like her, not to create fear for people like him. He listened quietly, then thanked me again. Before he left, he said one more thing. He said caring for his mother had taught him patience, humility, and resilience. He said being treated with understanding had reminded him that those qualities still have a place in the world. Then he shook my hand and walked out. I sat there for a long time after that. I didn't rush back to work. I thought about his mother. I thought about my own parents. I thought about how many caregivers never hear the words, "You're doing the right thing." And I wished more people would say them. That evening I went home and sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. My wife noticed and sat with me. I told her about the visit. She listened quietly, then reached for my hand. She said that sometimes justice isn't about what you do in the moment, but about what that moment allows someone else to carry. As the weeks passed, life continued. New cases, new stories, new decisions, but that one stayed with me. It became part of how I see the bench, the robe, and the responsibility that comes with them. I've learned something important over the years. The law is strongest when it recognizes humanity, when it remembers that people don't live in neat boxes. They live in complicated, emotional, demanding realities. And sometimes the most just thing you can do is simply listen. I think about that missed court date often. On paper, it was nothing, a failure to appear. But in reality, it was a choice between duty to the law and duty to love. And I will never believe that love should be punished. People ask me sometimes how I decide when to show compassion. The truth is, compassion isn't something you turn on and off. It's something you bring with you every day. You still uphold the law. You still respect the rules. But you leave room for understanding. That man didn't ask for mercy. He didn't demand exceptions. He showed responsibility long before he stood in front of me. All I did was recognize it. Justice didn't weaken that day. It worked exactly as it should. After 40 years on this bench, I've seen people at their worst and their best. I've learned that character reveals itself in quiet choices, not loud words. Caring for someone who depends on you is one of those choices. If there's one lesson I carry forward from this story, it's this. Never assume you know someone's full story by looking at a file. Never confuse exhaustion with disrespect. And never forget that listening can change the outcome of a life. I still see caregivers come into my courtroom. I still ask questions. I still listen. And every time I do, I think about that man, his mother, and a missed court date that taught me something lasting. I've been Frank Caprio, sitting on this bench for more than 4 decades, because I believe something simple. Justice should make people better, not break them. We are all equal before the law, but we are also all human. And when the law remembers that, it does its best work. Thank you for listening to this story.